Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to our first lesson in our next time period here. We're going to be looking at a new century, looking between the years of 1900 to 1920 mainly. So for today we're going to look at roles in the family and work. Our objectives and standards are to understand the role of women in the home and in the family from 1900 to 1920, and to analyze struggles and success women faced in the workplace. Please read the standards there as well. Desired result, what were the roles and responsibilities of women at home and at work? So vocabulary, we have Hull House, which was founded by Jane Addams and used to support struggling individuals, typically those in poverty. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGW, it was an organization that wanted to improve working conditions for textile workers. Try saying that word 5 times fast. And then we also have the National Consumers League, which was an organization that urged people to buy goods only from companies that had fair wages and hours for their employees. And the International Workers of the World, or the IWW, was an organization of male and female workers, that wanted fair working standards. So women in the new century. During the early 20th century, many women began spending more time outside the home. Some began to form groups or organizations, especially if they were wealthy, because they had more free time, since many of them probably had servants who were able to work for them. Those who were not wealthy, unfortunately, had to continue to balance that working and family life, which we see as a theme here throughout women in history. Eventually, some wealthy women began to form groups or organizations that could help struggling women and their families. So life changes in the family. The rise of industrialized society led to many changes for families. Both the husband and the wife would go to work in many poor families. And many women began to move away from domestic jobs and towards factory jobs. They also had to care for their children and their families as well. There was also a change in family life that led to a high divorce rate. This alarmed many people, and some looked to social reforms to make improvements. Now, other social problems. During the time period, many Americans lived in cities that had poor conditions, which you kind of see example of here. People lived in overcrowded rooms or apartments that were dirty, and those who did work typically worked very long days, typically about 14 hours per day. Just to give you an idea, the typical working day today is about 8 hours. So compared to 14 hours back around the turn of the century, that's a lot. Now, children also worked in factories and other jobs, sometimes also facing dangerous conditions. Women sometimes face violence from their husbands, and because of all these different things, others took notice of these social and family problems and decided to take action. So, improving society. There were several states that made their divorce laws more strict, and they also tried to look at a way to prevent bad marriages from happening. For example, some of these required age requirements, so we don't have 40-year-old men marrying 15-year-old girls. They tried to improve those types of age requirements and things like that happened in the past. They also tried to look into making sure people were mentally stable, healthy, not addicted to drugs or alcohol. That way they could create better marriages across society. Unfortunately, some of these laws were very difficult to enforce, though. But it was a start. It was a good starting point to try and improve society. We also see education improve. We'll start to see school attendance laws, so making a requirement that children between certain ages go to school, and requiring them to get education. We'll also take children out of those dangerous working conditions and out of those dangerous factories, so that'll be a good thing as well. Now, many books and magazines were published about how to raise children. 2 women here that were very important we have Florence Kelley. up here in the top left-hand corner up here. Then down here in the bottom, we have Lillian Ward. They both work to improve the health and welfare of children by helping to form something called the Children's Bureau. The Children's Bureau looked to, make children healthy, make sure children, were in safe working conditions and things like that. And then in the top right-hand corner here, we have Jane Addams. And Jane Addams founded the Hull House, which was a settlement house, which we talked about last week, which provided services to the poor and also to struggling families as well. Now the birth control movement. Women also pushed for improvements in birth control as well. Margaret Sanger, the top picture here, and Emma Goldman, right down here in the bottom right, they both held public rallies and campaigns about limiting the number of children women had. Those who did support birth control stated that high birth rates put women's health at risk and made families struggle if they had too many children. Also in 1916, Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States in Brooklyn, New York. The clinic offered birth control information to women, but that broke the law. It was illegal in New York. The clinic was later shut down, but Sanger and others continued to push for birth control reform. There's also another woman here, Mary Ward Dennett, tried to change the Comstock Law. Remember, the Comstock Law tried to ban mailing birth control information to women, or trying to stop what they called quote-unquote immoral, mailings going out to families. So she founded the Voluntary Parenthood League, which was formerly known as the National Birth Control League. But again, she's going to try to get birth control information out to women if they would like to have it as well. Now, the fight against alcohol. In 1873, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, was founded. Its goals included the banning of the sale and use of alcohol. Now, the reason for this is many of its members saw alcohol as the reason for problems in society. And that woman there that you see in the picture right here with her hatchet, Carrie Nation, she was a leading figure of the WCTU in the 1900s. So Nation carried a hatchet, which is kind of like a small axe, and entered saloons where she launched violent attacks. And this cartoon over here kind of shows you. I don't believe she ever really violently hurt anybody physically, but she would go in, she would scream and yell, she'd start, chopping at tables and chairs, and people obviously jumped up and get out of the way. You can see here in the cartoon, look at this, maybe she's smashing mirrors and smashing bottles or glasses or whatever. So that was something that she did. She was very well known for. I don't mean to laugh, but that's a pretty good cartoon there that kind of gives a good depiction of that. Members of the movement actually called for a national ban on alcohol by 1910, and they will actually be successful at this. In 1920, the U.S. government will pass the Prohibition Act, which banned the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol. So we'll talk more about the impact of that on society and women when we get to the 1920s and 1930s as well. So the growth of working women. The amount of women working in the early 20th century rose dramatically. Unfortunately, a majority of them worked in horrible conditions in factories, but due to the poor working conditions and long hours, some women are going to decide to take action as well. Now, most of the changes they pushed for took place in the form of consumer pressure and legal cases. 1899, a group of women formed a group to force their employers to treat women more fairly. It was called the National Consumers League, and it pushed for people to buy items for companies that treated their workers fairly. And you might say, well, how did they do this? One thing that they did was they pushed for reforms such as higher wages, a shorter working day, no child labor, vacation time, and lunch breaks. And what they also did was they published a list of companies that would show, these companies have good wages for people, they treat their employees well, so go buy from them. And then they created another list that listed the companies that didn't do that. So they would tell people, hey, don't shop from this list because these companies don't treat their employees well. And people followed it. And, this did have an impact on companies that many companies will be forced to kind of make some changes. So ladies unite for unions. So during the early years of the 1900s, many unions were formed for female worker rights. We have the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, ILGW, New York City, New York in 1900, and the Women's Trade Union League, the WTUL, 1903. 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, was founded in Chicago, Illinois. Now, the thing about the IWW was it had a lot of radicals, people who were maybe a little extreme, but they did use strikes and protest and picketing to get their message across. And they're able to, a lot of these unions are able to get a lot of reforms through because of their picketing and striking. Changes and challenges. In 1908, the U.S. Supreme Court case Muller v. Oregon ruled that long hours for employees causes health problems for women, so we'll begin to see, again, many changes that way, shorter working days. On November 22nd, 1909, 20,000 workers went on strike in New York City, New York, to protest unfair working conditions. Unfortunately, many of these workers, including women, were arrested. But what happens here is some of the wealthier women bail these people out and try to get more reforms pushed. As a result of this as well, some factories are forced to agree to better working hours and conditions. And a very sad event happened on March 25th, 1911. There was a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, which resulted in the deaths of 146 people, many of them women. Shirtwaist Company is kind of like a clothing company back then. The building did not have a sprinkler system. It didn't have a good fire escape, and this still makes me crazy. But the doors were actually locked to keep employees from taking unauthorized breaks. So when people tried to escape, they really couldn't. They were basically trapped. So like I said, unfortunately, many of these workers, like I said, a lot of them women and young women at that fact, were killed in this event. The public obviously learned about this, the shock and the outrage about this. So many politicians began to push for safety laws at workplaces. Many of these women died of suffocation, they burned to death, and some of them actually jumped out windows too to try to save themselves. So again, a lot of public outrage. So we'll see things begin to change. Crazier even enough is that the Triangle Shirtwaist Company was found not guilty of manslaughter, but we'll see more protests and strikes take place around the country, which will bring about some other changes as well. Now, supporting the war effort. During the spring of 1917, the United States decided to enter World War I. So thousands of men are going to begin to join the military, and women will take up the jobs to fill the gap of men at war. They worked in factories, steel mills, farms, mines, and some women also worked on trains and streetcars. Other women, as you can see this poster here, kind of calling for all women to kind of pull together and work together for victory. They supported the war effort by collecting items such as clothing or food or money, or serving as nurses as well. Many of them worked in weapons factories as well, making bullets or bombs or whatever. When men did return home from war in November 1918, many of them, of course, wanted their jobs back, and many women will return back to the home or wherever they were from, but many of them will also keep their jobs as well, and continue to work. Alright, so our closure. What were the roles and responsibilities of women at home and at work? Think about that. Help you answer your question there. Let us know if you need help, and we will talk to you guys soon. Take care.